get started. And now that you're all seated, I'm going to ask you to stand up for our opening prayer. We're going to do our best to sing. You'll recognize the melody. I put in red the kinds of content that I think are particularly important to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'll try to get us started and do your best. As a fire is meant for burning with a bright and warming flame, so the church is meant for mission, giving glory to God's name. Not to preach our creeds or customs, but to build a bridge of care. We join hands across the nations, finding neighbors everywhere. We are learners, we are teachers, we are pilgrims on the way. We are seekers, we are givers, we are vessels made of clay. By our gentle, loving actions, we would show that Christ is light. In a humble, listening spirit, we would live to God's delight. Please remain standing.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. That very day, the first day of the week, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. How our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that, while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us? So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
A sneak preview, if you want to know what it means to be a synodal church, just keep wrestling with that reading, because in the literature that talks about being a synodal church, that parable or that story is listed as kind of a paradigmatic instance of what that looks like. So I mentioned last week that some folks had asked, do you have to be here every week? And I said, no, I'm going to do a contextualization each week to let us know how this fits in. So last week we talked about the church being the body of Christ. We looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 12 in particular, 11 and 12, recognized that for Paul, unity and differentiation was important. All the gifts are important. And in fact, those who seem to be least important are regarded with the greatest dignity. At the second part of that session, we looked at some neuroscience and recognized that in contemporary science, the body is immersed in an environment beyond it, and a good task of keeping the body alive means how it interacts with that larger environment. A lot of that happens unconsciously and then with some deliberate attempts at making sense of our environment. But that naturally leads into what being synodal is all about, because if we're going to see being synodal is not about having meetings, although it can mean that. It's about how we are with one another and who we choose to be with as we go along our journey. As we're walking on our journey, like these disciples on the road to Emmaus, and we uncover things that we need to work on and talk about, understanding what is true and how to make sense of that and what about that to share and how to share it becomes critical. So the church is going to be a community of people, a body of Christ, that is going to be seekers and speakers of truth. And once that truth is talked about again, newly discovered, or maybe discovered for the first time, then that shapes us for being partners in mission. So that's where being synodal fits in this 4-week series. So here's what I'm hoping will happen tonight by way of progress. First, I'm going to introduce some key concepts, at least key concepts that I've discovered. And there is a document that I've been working off of. It's in Latin. It's called the Instrumental Laboris, which literally means a working paper. And this was promulgated by the Vatican a couple of months ago, maybe earlier than that. And it kind of lays out where we've come from and where it hopes to go. So I've read this a couple of times, and I want to identify concepts that keep coming up over and over again. Then I'll give you briefly some background to the meeting that's going to take place in Rome from October 4th to October 26th, I believe it is, in Rome, which is actually a synodal meeting. Okay? Now I want to be clear here that although a synod can refer to a meeting, bishops have synods every 3 years, the intent of Pope Francis's innovation is that the church as a whole should always be synodal in its processes and structures. We'll talk about what that means as we go on. The working paper is clear that when we listen to the Spirit, we don't do so in a vacuum, but always in particular concrete contexts. And the working paper names some of those contexts. Then it offers several characteristics of what it calls a synodal church. If we were to look at the church and it really was synodal, what kinds of things would we recognize? And then after that, I'll give you a chance for some small group conversation. And then, after the small group conversation, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what really is a very key concept in being a synodal church from the point of view of the working document, and that's conversation in the Spirit. There's a very particular method that is suggested for having conversation in the Spirit so that when people do talk to one another, they recognize not just their own voices, but the voice of the Spirit. Then, the Instrumental Laboris, the working paper, offers about 30 pages of questions for the meeting to consider. I'm just going to do an overview of actually conversation. This overview should have been a separate item. I'm going to let you know what the overview of the worksheets looks like, and then we're going to take a detailed look at one of the worksheets so you can get a flavor of what the conversations might be. Then more small group conversation, large group feedback, and closing prayer. In structuring this evening, I was hoping that we wouldn't only be talking about being synodal, but that this itself could be a kind of synodal exercise. It's a little artificial because a synodal church would bring to these conversations some advanced preparation and prayer and reflection, but we'll do our best tonight to be attentive to how the Spirit might be moving among us. So here's some key concepts in synodality. And by the way, I'm going to give you a handout which has these concepts on them as we go forward tonight. So the working metaphor, the primary metaphor that is used for synodality is walking together with one another. And you can see why the Emmaus story would be so perfect. There's two disciples, they're walking together on that road to Emmaus. They're entering into a conversation, a heart-to-heart conversation in a particular context. And in the course of that conversation, they discover that Christ is present with them. And then with some additional reflection on the Spirit that He opens up for them, and the breaking of the bread, they eventually recognize that He is with them. And as a result of that conversation and that recognition, then they are spurred to mission. They go back to their fellow disciples and say, we've met Him. We've met Him. He appeared to us in the breaking of bread. In the working paper, there are three broad areas that the Synod Fathers, or the document, indicates as important for consideration: communion, mission, and participation. And when I mentioned those 30 pages of questions, about 10 pages of each of those go with each of these topics. And the document is clear to say that communion and mission have to be considered together. As we're working on building communion, that is in fact part of our mission. And then having brought those two together, then we can talk about how people participate together in that mission. I think I mentioned already that the listening and the conversation can't be just generalities, but they have to take place in specific contexts. And as I mentioned already, conversation in the Spirit is, I think, the single most important methodological concept. I like this. The document says, in these conversations in a synodal church, although we're talking to one another, it is the Spirit that is the protagonist. It is the Spirit's voice that is leading us and that we want to be attentive to. Again, the theme of unity and diversity comes up, just as it did last week. And not only unity and diversity, but it seems to me from the document that diversity is something that that synodality actually seeks. Discernment is a key concept. So we are not only listening to one another, but we are actively trying to figure out what is the Spirit saying to us about our particular context, what we're called to be, what we might ask to be able to engage in as a synodal church, where we need to go forward. Never finished. We never become completely church. Or at least we're never a finished product, because times, places, circumstances, context, those things change and the Spirit keeps moving. And so this is something that's an ongoing aspect of the church's identity. So now some background to the 2023 Synod in Rome. This process began a couple of years ago with the issuing of a document from Rome inviting the church to enter a 3-year process. The first part of the process was providing local churches, and by local churches that meant dioceses throughout the world, and within those dioceses, parishes and institutions. Provided them with questions and ideas for reflection, and it asked each of those local churches to engage in honest heart-to-heart conversation, and then to put together a summary of what they heard in those conversations, and then send them from the parish to send them to the diocese, and then the diocese would send what they heard to the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. And there are several conferences of Catholic bishops around the world. So by the end of the first part of the process, every Episcopal conference around the world had several documents that they then worked into a document that represented the findings of the listening of their national conference. Then, when they put their papers together, they were sent to Rome, and Rome put together what they called, when they sent those in, and each continent put a summary of what the dioceses on their continent had to say. Tried to put together a little summary and identify the most salient topics that came up. Then those things were sent to Rome for consideration, and those documents then went to something called the General Secretariat for the Synod, which resulted in the working paper that we're working off of tonight. So there's been a ground-up process for a couple of years. And by ground up, I don't mean torn up, but I mean from the ground up. Okay. And so now, the working document, the Instrumental Laboris, is intended to be food for conversation for the 450 plus people who are gathering in Rome. What's very interesting about this process is that normally it's just bishops who are considered voting members. This year, for the first time, there will be people who aren't bishops, laymen and women and religious men and women. They're still in a minority, but it is a significant difference from previous synods that have taken place. I thought it was fascinating that they're going to begin this process with a 4-day retreat. They're going to couch this engagement in prayer. And that's, I should have put prayer in the key concepts, because over and over again the working paper says this can only happen in a prayerful context. And then, after they have their 4-day retreat, then they're going to have a series of meetings. Some are going to be what they call plenary sessions, where the whole group is going to get together for meetings, and then they're going to break into subgroups, and those subgroups will have conversations, and then those subgroups will come back together for additional large group conversations, and they'll be going back and forth for the better part of those 3+ weeks. When that conversation is done, then there will be some committee of people, I suppose, who will put together another document that tries to identify what has been heard in this synod, and then that paper will be sent out again to people who will be in another synod meeting next October. And then coming out of that meeting, hopefully there would come some concrete and specific strategies, ways of dealing with what has been heard, ways of being a synodal church. So you can see we're in the middle of something. And as I've thought about this, I was surprised to find myself getting excited. It felt a little bit like this has the potential to have a feel of what someone has said might even feel like a Vatican III. You know, the same kind of enthusiasm and change of heart and re-envisioning of what it means to be church that happened there could possibly come out of this synodal process. Remember, it's never finished. For the sake of full disclosure, what you have to know is that this process has not been without its detractors. Okay? There's been some significant pushback, in particular from some bishops, some in Latin America, some in North America. In fact, a book has just been published with 100 questions that is challenging the synod process out of concern that it's going to change church teaching. And if you look at the people who are contributors to that document, it is, for lack of a better word, some traditional right-wing bishops. And I believe Raymond Burke, I think it's Raymond Burke, who was a cardinal, has written the introduction to that book. So, but, the people who wrote the Instrumental Laboris would say, you know what? Part of synodality is to be able to engage diversity and difference of opinion. So we don't let those things hobble us, but we try to find ways to have conversations, even respectfully, with people who look and think about this differently than we do. So what are some of the concrete, specific contexts that have been identified in the conversations so far? Remember, these are worldwide conversations, all the continents of the world, and these are the kinds of places that the document says we need to be listening to the Spirit, what the Spirit has to say in these kinds of contexts. This list is not exhaustive, but it's meant to be illustrative. First of all, the document said, there's just too many wars in the world. We have to come to grips with the fact that humanity is a warmongering race, apparently. And there are a lot of people who suffer as a result of their experience of being in wars. Not only the active participants, but those who are the people who are the innocent sufferers. Climate change is a big issue that's identified. And part of the reason it's identified is that the document writers say this is only going to be addressed if we can, as a global community, have some conversations that are meaningful and that result in some initiatives that are going to help preserve our planet. And the church as a whole needs a voice in that conversation. Unjust economic systems. There's concern about the poor, about the systems that keep people poor, about the lack of access to power and agency in so many places. And those unjust economic systems form the environment and the imaginations of so many people around the world. And the document is pretty clear. We need to hear what the Spirit is saying to those folks. Okay? And sometimes those of us who live in a more wealthy part of the world, we don't hear those voices. But those are the voices that in particular we must be hearing. It recognizes that in certain parts of the world, Christians are under persecution, especially when they are minority populations in countries that are either largely secular or have mainstream other religions. Urgent social realities. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Growing cultural pluralism is mentioned. What is the experience of Christian minorities? And secularization. Those things are mentioned as particular contexts. And then abuse. And the document mentions not only sexual abuse, and not only sexual abuse by clergy, but also abuse of power and abuse of conscience, and it signals that sometimes ministers in the church are guilty of those kinds of abuses as well. And then it goes on to say that all of those contexts signal for us that something that's going to happen as a result of this ongoing conversation and listening to the Spirit is going to suggest to us that there might be a need for some conversion. Okay? So now let's take a quick look at what the document says are characteristics of a synodal church. Recognition of the baptismal dignity of all. I think the two key phrases here are recognition and baptismal. Too often, we don't recognize that all who are baptized are part of a common body of Christ, to use the image that we used last week. And a failure to recognize our oneness in that body causes us to miss seeing things and hearing things. Okay? So recognition of baptismal dignity. Now we're going to see as we go on that it's not only the baptized who enter these conversations, but a primary focus of synodality is engaging all the baptized in conversations. The document says it's not enough to just talk to one another and listen to one another in the Spirit. We need to have structures and procedures and institutions that allow that to become a part of the natural framework of how the church is and how the church operates. So we don't want this to go away. We want to build into how we are a sense of foundations that keep us on the synodal way. Listening, 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 listening. A synodal church is one that is listening. Sometimes we think of evangelization, and we think that evangelization means talking. It means talking at people, teaching them stuff. The synodal church, it's a church that listens. It listens, and then only after listening does the conversation and the, let's say, the more specific content surface in talking. A characteristic of a synodal church is the desire to be humble. Isn't that interesting? One of my core convictions that I've developed over the years is that I've thought that our hierarchy would be much more effective if it wasn't so overconfident. You know, I think a healthy dose of humility would be really helpful for bishops, some priests, and other ministers in the church. And of course, unless we're humble, we're really not going to be able to listen to one another because we'll be too busy filtering what people are saying through what we already know or what we think we know and close ourselves off to maybe what needs to inform or challenge us. A synodal church knows that there is much to be learned. And indeed, this is just another way of saying that God's not done with us, that the Spirit continues to move. The Scriptures say the Spirit moves where it will. We know not where it comes from, we know not where it goes. Well, we know ultimately where it comes from, but we don't know the direction it's blowing. And we have to leave open the possibility that we still have something to learn. And remember that characteristic of incompleteness. The synodal church is going to know we've sinned. And as we talk to people and as we hear the voices of people who are suffering or who have been victims of things, we're going to discover that we may need to ask forgiveness, or in some cases extend forgiveness. A synodal church is a church of encounter and dialogue. And one of the partners in dialogue and encounter that is specifically mentioned in the working paper is dialogue and encounter with Christians of other traditions, with other Christian churches, an ecumenical characteristic. In fact, somewhere in the document it says, some of our Christian sisters and brothers of other churches have been operating in a synodal way for many centuries. We have a lot to learn from them about how to be synodal. But then it broadens the space of encounter to include believers of other religions. Our Vatican documents say that we have the conviction that there is truth in other religions, and so to dialogue with people of other religions we can learn something from them. A dialogue with cultures and societies in which the church is embedded. And if you consider the fact that this is a worldwide process, just think of the multiplicity of cultures and situations in which the church finds itself. The document says, we're not going to ask anybody to leave their specific context, but what we're going to try to do is get people in various specific contexts to talk to one another and share with one another what they're hearing as part of a way to enrich the synodality of the entire church. And it says, we want to encounter with the differences that run through the church itself, not afraid of the variety it bears, but it values those differences without forcing it into uniformity. The Synodal Church is welcoming and embracing of all. And here's an interesting quote. There is no border that this movement of the Spirit does not feel compelled to cross, to draw all into its dynamism. This is, I think, an important and challenging characteristic of a synodal church, to understand the relationship of love and truth. We are called to love one another, to be in conversation with one another, to share honestly our experience, to try to hear what the Spirit is saying, and sometimes what the Spirit is saying may challenge what we are saying. And so the ability to identify the relationship between love and truth. It's one of the reasons why next week we're going to talk about being a church that seeks the truth and that speaks the truth. Again, managing and living with tensions without being crushed by them. The document says a synodal church is going to have a healthy restlessness about it. There's going to be an ongoing recognition that there's still more work to do. There's still more to learn. There's still more need to work with one another. There's still more need to be on mission together. We're never finished. And it says, we should be restless with the incompleteness of it. That incompleteness calls us to keep on moving. And then it says that all of this is informed by our ongoing liturgical practice. It's where we hear the word, it's where we pray together, it's where the presence of Christ is with us, the presence of the Spirit. That's a part of the ongoing formation that makes us a synodal church. And as I mentioned earlier, a church of discernment. Now again, these are, according to this, these are characteristics of what the church should be if it's really synodal. When I was growing up, I was taught that the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Okay, and that teaching is still there, but this is a significant expansion on what characteristics of the church ought to look like if it's truly going to be synodal. Okay, so now we're going to have some small group conversation. Okay, so I'm giving you these handouts because of the questions that I'm asking you. The backside of that is for part 2. So, what characteristic signs of a synodal church do you think are most needed in the wider church today? And then, which of these signs would you like to see or experience at Our Lady of the Lake? And give some examples. All right, so you're going to have a few minutes to talk about this. And if we were really operating in a synodal process, you would have been praying over this in the week prior to this. But instead, we're going to rely on the Spirit to move. Yes?
Wider church as in Catholic church or wider church as in Christian?
By wider church, I mean the global Catholic Church, the diocese, bigger than the parish, okay? Because the second part looks at the parish. In fact, let's do this. Let's just take a couple of minutes of silence, take a look at those things and think about it. Then on my cue, you can begin to talk about it. Okay? So remember, we're looking at the bottom half of the page. So now we're going to take some time to look in a more in-depth fashion at what the Instrumental Laboris, the working paper, means by conversation in the Spirit. And again, there's a deliberate attempt to let this be the method of meeting with one another in synodality, the method of walking with one another that is synodality. So conversation is at the core of this. And again, I use the language of the document. Conversation is a dynamic in which the word spoken and heard generates familiarity, enabling the participants to draw closer to one another. Okay, so the conversation has to be such that we don't drive each other from the table, but rather we grow in kind of a mutual understanding. We hear each other with a little more compassion and empathy. The Spirit is the protagonist, and the Emmaus story, as we heard a little while ago, is paradigmatic for conversation in the Spirit. Whether they knew it or not, the disciples on the road to Emmaus were in a conversation that was animated by the Spirit. And then, with that kind of conversation, the document says, gradually a space is opened up for hearing together. Not just what am I hearing, but what are we as a collective hearing in the conversation. So there's 3 steps in the process. But before we get to step 1, I want to emphasize that the whole process is intended to be one that is thoroughly rooted in prayer. Before the conversation begins, after the conversation, before the next step of the conversation, so that over and over and over again, the Spirit kind of animates each individual, and then the larger group can be animated by that same Spirit. The document said the conversations of the Spirit are not meant to be something that is just improvised on the spot. So step 1, there will be some content, thank you, there's some content that people would have been praying and reflecting upon ahead of time. The first step is listening. It says each person takes the floor, starting from his or her own experience, reread in prayer during the period of preparation. So the preparation. So each person takes the floor, and others listen, knowing that each contribution is valuable. And in this first step, they refrain from discussion and debate. So the whole first step is listening to what prayer has led this person to share, or each person in the group. You saw when we were talking about characteristics of a synodal church, listening is one of them. Step 2 is sharing what was heard. That begins with silence and prayer, in which each person in the conversation goes into his or her heart and asks, what did I hear? And each person again takes the floor, not to react or to counter what has been said, but rather to express what from their listening has touched them most deeply and what they feel challenged by most strongly. So let me say that again. Each person takes the floor in the second step, not to react or to counter what has been said, but to express what from their listening has touched them most deeply and what they feel challenged by most strongly. Allowing the Spirit to emerge in a communion, it's been a common hearing, which over time is nourished by the Word, the liturgy, the magisterium, and theology. Step 3, again in an atmosphere of prayer, under the guidance of the Spirit, identify the key points that have emerged and build consensus on the fruits of their joint work. What have we learned as a group? What are we feeling led to as a group? And the document mentions, the working paper says, paying attention to marginal and prophetic voices, lest they be lost. Okay? And then there's a couple of general principles. I love this general principle. I'll quote directly. Whenever we encounter another person in love, we learn something about God. I think that's profound. Whenever we encounter another person in love, we learn something about God. Think of the potential for a synodal church to learn about God. And the document is realistic enough to know that this process that I have just outlined is an ideal process, but it's got to be adopted and adapted to particular contexts and circumstances if it's going to work. Okay? So now, I mentioned earlier that 3 general topics were identified to be talked about at this meeting in October: communion, communion, mission, and participation. Each of those topics is introduced by an overarching question. So the question for the conversation about communion is, how can we be more fully assigned, this is just to give you a flavor, okay? How can we be more fully assigned an instrument of union with God and of the unity of all humanity? The question for mission is, how can we better share the gifts and tasks in the service of the gospel? And the question for participation is, what processes, structures, and institutions in a synodal church? Each of these questions is divided into 5 sub-questions. And then each of those sub-questions is divided into several other questions. So that by the time the people who are participating in the synod get this, they've got their work cut out for them. Okay? And the working document is honest when it says this is not meant to be a finished product, it's meant to be something that helps facilitate the ongoing conversation. So, if you look at the reverse side of the paper that I gave you, this gives you a sample of what one of those sub-questions looked like. Okay? So a question for discernment, and by the way, this is only half of one of the questions. Okay? So what steps can a synodal church take to imitate ever more closely its Master and Lord, who walks with all in unconditional love and proclaims the fullness of gospel truth? And then you can see other suggestions for prayer and preparatory reflection. Okay, coming into the conversation, these would be things that folks would be asked to consider. What is the attitude with which we approach the world? Do we know how to recognize? Do we know to recognize what is good and at the same time commit ourselves to prophetically denounce all that violates the dignity of persons, human communities, and creation? How can we speak in a prophetic voice to expose what is evil without further fragmenting of our communities? Boy, is that a good question. How can we become a church that deals honestly with its conflicts and is not afraid to safeguard spaces for disagreement? How can we restore proximity and caring relationships as the core of the church's mission? Walking with people instead of talking about them or solely at them. In the spirit of the just look at the second question. How can a preferential option for young people be at the center of our pastoral strategies and synodal life? How can we continue to take meaningful and concrete steps to offer justice to victims and survivors of sexual abuse and spiritual, economic, power, and conscience abuse by persons who are carrying out a ministry or ecclesial responsibility? How can we create spaces where those who feel hurt by the church and unwelcomed by the community feel recognized, received, and free to ask questions and not judged? In the light of the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, what concrete steps are needed to welcome those who feel excluded from the church because of their status or sexuality? For example, remarried divorcees, people in polygamous marriages, recognize this as a global document, LGBTQ+ people, etc. How can we be more open and welcoming towards migrants and refugees, ethnic and cultural minorities, and indigenous communities who have long been part of the church but are often on the margins? How can the church better embrace their presence as a gift? What physical and cultural barriers do we need to break down so that people with disabilities can feel that they are full members of the community? How can we enhance the contribution of older people to the life of the Christian community and society? All right, so I'm going to let you know what the questions are, and I'm going to ask you to take some silence again to consider these questions and then answer, in your experience, and I say that advisedly, in your experience, what questions from this page are most urgently in need of attention? And if we get to it, in our specific context as the American Church, the Diocese of Cleveland, Our Lady of the Lake, how would you begin to respond to these questions and share them with others in the church? I'd say focus on the first question. If we have time, then go into the second one. But just take a little bit of silence now to consider what we just read and which do you think would be most urgently in need of attention? Can we please enter into some silence? And I would like to ask you this question. What is your impression overall of synodality? What in this conversation today impresses you, gives you hope, challenges you? Please think about that for a little bit. And then anybody who would like, I'll give you a chance to share it with the larger group. What I gave you was one of 15 sets of questions that people had to reflect on and pray, and they're going to have 3 weeks to do that. So hopefully they've been praying, but I think, yes, we want to acknowledge that we need to pray for them as well. And there was a little bit of a deliberate intent on my part to have this topic before the meeting in Rome began, so that there'd be some awareness of what was going on there. Okay, well, I will encourage you to continue to share with one another your impressions. I thank you for your participation. Next week, I think, is going to be a challenging topic. Seeking the truth and speaking the truth. Because underneath all that is, of course, the question that Pilate puts to Jesus. Truth, what does that mean? And there's, you talk about an ocean subject. We'll try to talk about that in a way that is accessible and helpful to the conversation next week. All right, so may I ask you to please stand? We're going to end as we began. Same melody. As a green bud in the springtime is a sign of life renewed, so may we be signs of oneness, mimics peoples many-hued. As a rainbow lights the heavens when a storm is past and gone, may our lives reflect the radiance of God's new and glorious dawn. By the way, if you're interested in looking at the full Instrumental Laboris, the document that I was referring to, you can find it on the website of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Okay? It's substantial, but at least now, with this conversation, maybe you have a roadmap for how to navigate that. Okay? So go carefully, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next week.